Here's the sentence that ended my family. We already gave your signature to the bank. My father said it like he was handing me a compliment, like he'd saved me a trip to the DMV. I'm Merrin Cole. I'm 36. I build things for a living. I'm a structural engineer, which means my whole job is figuring out what's actually holding a building up, versus what just looks like it is. Turns out I'm terrible at that question when the building is my own family. I found out my parents forged my signature on a $61,000 home equity loan 11 months ago, in a car dealership parking lot, on my lunch break, reading a credit report I'd pulled for my own mortgage application. And that wasn't even the worst thing they did to me that year. It wasn't close. Stick around, because by the end of this, my little brother will lose a business. My mother will ask me a question in a hospital hallway that I will never forgive, and my father, who never once told me he loved me out loud, will leave me something in a garage that says it better than he ever could have. If you've ever been the reliable one, the one who gets called when something's wrong, and never when something's good, you're going to feel this one in your teeth. Tell me where you're watching from, and let's get into it. Part 1. The report. 3 months before the parking lot, I got a text from my mother that read, "Family meeting Sunday. Bring nothing, just yourself. Bring nothing." I should have written that down as a warning. My mother is a woman who irons napkins for a Tuesday dinner. Bring nothing, from her, is a loaded gun. I drove the 2 hours out to Millhaven anyway, past the exit for the hardware store my dad ran for 30 years before it folded, past the church, past my brother Caleb's brewery, a converted barn with a hand-painted sign that still smells like optimism and fresh lumber even from the road. My parents' house was full when I got there. Not just my parents. My Aunt Ruth was on the good couch. Caleb was there with his wife Priya, visibly, obviously pregnant, hand resting on her stomach the whole meeting like a prop she'd rehearsed. And on the coffee table, already fanned out like a hand of cards somebody else had dealt, sat a stapled document with a notary stamp on it. Nobody had told me there'd be paperwork. My father did the talking, which should have told me something on its own. My father does not talk. 30 years behind a hardware counter, and the man communicates mostly in nods and receipts. But he cleared his throat and said the house, the land, and what was left in savings would go to Caleb when they passed, all of it. He said the word stability 4 times in 90 seconds. He said it the way you say a word you've been coached to say. I asked why. My Aunt Ruth answered before either of my parents could. Because Caleb's about to have a baby and a business, and you've got neither. She said it kindly, which somehow made it worse. Kindness delivered like a diagnosis. I looked at my mother. She reached over and patted my knee and said the 4 words that would define the next year of my life. You'll always be steady. Steady. Not loved, not needed. Steady. Like a shelf bracket. Like something you bolt to a wall and never think about again, because it's already doing its job. I didn't sign anything that day. I didn't cry either. That came later, alone, in a Target parking lot of all places, for reasons I still can't fully explain, except that Target is where you go when you need to feel like a normal person for 10 minutes, and your brain picks that exact moment to break instead. What I didn't know yet, what none of us knew was coming, is that the paperwork on that coffee table wasn't the real story. The real story was already 5 years old. Part 2. What the report actually said. Here's what a credit report doesn't do. It doesn't ask permission before it tells you the truth. 8 months after the family meeting, I sat down to apply for my own mortgage. A small brick 2-bedroom outside the city. The first thing I'd ever tried to build a life around that wasn't somebody else's emergency. My loan officer, a guy named Desmond who'd clearly delivered bad news before, went quiet for a second too long while reading my file. There's a co-signed home equity line under your name, he said. Millhaven address. Opened 5 years ago. $61,400. You're showing as 50% liable. I told him that was impossible. I had never co-signed anything for my parents in my life. He turned the screen around. There it was. My name. My social security number. A signature that was almost mine. Close enough to fool a bank. Not close enough to fool an engineer who spends her whole career staring at things that are supposed to line up and don't. I called my father from the parking lot before I'd even started my car. And he told me, in the same calm voice he uses to explain talk specs, that the hardware store's final year had needed a cash injection the bank wouldn't approve without a second name on it, and mine was the strongest credit they had access to, and he'd meant to mention it, and honestly, sweetheart, it never came up because it never became a problem, until, apparently, it just had. We already gave your signature to the bank, he said, like a courtesy, like he'd carried my groceries in for me. 5 years. 5 years I'd been legally tied to a debt I never agreed to, on a loan that had gone, I would later learn, almost entirely toward 2 things: paying off the hardware store's final months, and seed money for Caleb's brewery. My name had been holding up both of their failures without my knowledge, while my brother's name was going on the deed to everything. I sat in that parking lot for 40 minutes, not crying, calculating, which, if you know engineers, is the same thing. Part 3, the quiet part. Now, here's where I have to back up, because none of what happens next makes sense unless you understand something about me. I am, and have always been, the family's emergency fund with a pulse. It started small, the way these things do. A car repair here, a just till payday there. Then the hardware store started dying for real. Foot traffic gone, a big box store 2 exits away, and my parents didn't tell me it was failing. They told me it needed a bridge. I sent $1,100 a month for what I was told would be 4 months. It was 31 months. I have the transfer history. I never once missed one, and I never once heard the words "thank you" attached to a single dollar of it. I heard "this is what family does," which is a different sentence wearing the same clothes. When the store finally closed anyway, I assumed the bleeding stopped. It didn't. It just changed direction, from the store's account into Caleb's, funneled through my parents so it would look, on paper, like a parental gift, instead of what it actually was, me, quietly financing my brother's second act, while my name sat, unbeknownst to me, on the paper that made it possible. I want to be clear about something, because it matters for what happens later. I was never asked to co-sign. I would have said no. I would have said no immediately, loudly, and with citations. That's exactly why they didn't ask. Twice, back when I still believed I was simply helping, I asked my mother to put something in writing, a loan agreement, an acknowledgement, anything. Both times she got that wounded look, the one she deploys like a fire extinguisher, and said something about paperwork putting a price tag on love. I believed her. I actually believed that not having proof was a form of trust, instead of what it really was, the absence of a paper trail being the entire design of the operation. So when Desmond turned that screen around, I wasn't just discovering a debt. I was discovering the blueprint, and once you see the real blueprint of a building, you can't unsee which walls were never load-bearing at all. They were just painted to look like they mattered. Part 4. The 30-day test. I didn't call anyone that week. I didn't scream. I didn't confront. I didn't send a single accusatory text. Instead, I did something my family would later describe, inaccurately, as going cold. What I actually did was run an experiment. I removed my name from the joint accounts I could remove it from. I stopped the monthly transfer that had quietly resumed itself, the way old habits do, into a fund labeled Mum and Dad, MISC. I called the bank about the forged co-signature and opened a fraud dispute, which is its own 6-month nightmare I won't bore you with, except to say, it worked, eventually, and it left a paper trail with the bank's name on it instead of mine. And then I waited. 30 days. No announcement, no ultimatum. I wanted to see what happened to the relationship when the money stopped moving through it. Here's the plot twist, and it's a quiet one. Nothing happened. For 30 days, my phone did not ring. Not one "Are you okay?" Not one "We haven't heard from you." My mother texted twice. Once to forward a photo of Caleb's ultrasound. Once to ask if I'd seen Ruth's Facebook post about a casserole recipe. 30 days of silence taught me something that 31 months of paying never had. The calls were never about me. They were about the next bill. And when there wasn't one, there was nothing to say. I started sleeping better than I had in years, which felt like a betrayal of some kind, and also felt like the first honest thing my body had told me in a decade. Then, on a Tuesday in October, 31 days in, my phone lit up mid-meeting. The bank called the house, something about the equity line. Call your father. No hello, no how are you. A dispatch, addressed to the department of me. I read it twice, then I typed back 4 words and hit send before I could talk myself out of it. That's not my line, which was, legally, now completely true. Part 5. The Fallout. It took 6 minutes for my father to call. It took 11 for my mother's second text. It took until Thursday for the sentence I'd been bracing for, without knowing its exact shape. Your father's blood pressure is through the roof because of this. I hope you can live with that. I could not, in fact, immediately live with that. But I'd learned something from watching buildings fail. The crack that shows up is rarely the crack that started the problem. So I didn't respond to the blood pressure. I called the fraud line back and asked them to email me written confirmation of the dispute, dated and time-stamped, and I saved it in a folder I labeled, with 0 poetry, evidence. My Aunt Ruth called next, using what I privately think of as her sermon voice. She told me family isn't a contract. I let that sentence sit in the air a second, because I wanted her to hear how it sounded once it left her mouth and had nowhere else to go. You're right, I said. It isn't a contract. A contract, at least, needs my signature. She didn't have anything to say to that. Neither, apparently, did the group chat, which I discovered the next morning I'd been quietly removed from. Not blocked, not left. Removed, like a load-bearing wall somebody decided, mid-renovation, was actually just in the way. Caleb showed up at my office on a Friday. Priya's due date was 6 weeks out. He stood in my lobby in a Carhartt jacket that still had brewery sawdust on the cuffs, and told me, with the particular confidence of a man who has never once had to check his own math, that the fraud dispute was going to mess up Dad's whole financial picture, and could I please just let it ride until after the baby? I asked him a question I already knew the answer to. Did he know his name was never on that loan, that mine was, without my knowledge, so that his could stay clean for the bank he'd need next? His face did something I'd never seen it do before. It's a specific kind of stillness, the one people get when a fact lands somewhere they can't immediately spin. That's not, Dad wouldn't do that without asking you, he said, which is the exact moment I understood he'd known. Maybe not the mechanics. But he'd known there was a hole somewhere beneath his floor, and he'd chosen, for years, not to look down. I didn't yell at him. I've found that the less I raise my voice in this family, the more thoroughly it seems to unsettle them. Like calm is a language they don't have a dictionary for. Part 6. What my father never said. 2 weeks later, my father asked me to meet him at the diner off Route 9. The good pie, the bad coffee, the booth by the window he sat in every Sunday of my life. He didn't bring my mother. That alone told me the conversation mattered. He talked about nothing for 10 minutes, the way he does before something real, a leaky faucet, a neighbour's fence, the price of lumber. Then he set his fork down and told me a story about my mother I had genuinely never heard. When my mother was 22, her own father got sick, 3 years of it, slow and ugly. She was the one who moved home, not Ruth, who had 2 kids by then, and circumstances. My mother put her nursing program on hold, then quietly let it lapse entirely, and spent 3 years managing medications and appointments, and a man who, by the end, didn't always know her name. When he died, what little he left went split between the sisters, and Ruth's half went toward a down payment on a house. My mother's half went toward the funeral, because somebody had to pay for it, and everyone had already decided it would be her. Nobody ever told her thank you, my dad said, turning his coffee cup a slow half-circle on the table. Not once. I think some part of her decided that was just what daughters do. Hold the family up, and don't expect the lights turned on for you. I sat with that. It didn't excuse a single thing my mother had done to me. But it explained the entire architecture of it. She wasn't inventing a new blueprint when she built our family around my silent, unpaid labor. She was reconstructing the only one she'd ever been handed, just with different names on the walls. I should have told you about the loan, my father said finally. It wasn't quite an apology. My father doesn't really do apologies. I'd learn later he does something else instead. I thought I was protecting you from the worry. You protected me from a decision, I said. That's not the same as protecting me from worry. He nodded slowly, the way he nods at an engine that isn't fixed yet, but that he's finally, at least, correctly diagnosed. Part 7. The collapse spring came, and with it, the kind of financial unraveling that happens slowly and then all at once, without the fraud-disputed line to lean on, and without the shadow support I'd been quietly providing for years. The brewery's numbers finally met daylight. Caleb had been running it on borrowed time and borrowed names for longer than anyone admitted, mine included, it turned out, in ways I hadn't even discovered yet. Priya had the baby in March, a girl. I sent a gift and meant it, because a newborn doesn't inherit her father's financial decisions and shouldn't be billed for them emotionally by me. By May, the brewery's landlord had started the eviction paperwork on the barn. By June, my parents, desperate and apparently still convinced I was some kind of renewable resource, asked me to co-sign a new loan, this time with my actual informed consent to save the business. I said no in 11 words, and I want you to know how good that felt to type. I already paid for this business once without knowing it. That's when my mother said the sentence I promised you at the start of this story. Not on the phone. In a hospital hallway, 3 weeks later, after my father, 68 years old, 3 decades of standing on a concrete hardware store floor behind him, collapsed in his own driveway from what turned out to be a heart attack. The doctors called moderate, but the man himself called, later, privately to me, a warning shot. I got there before my mother did. I sat with him in the ER, held his hand, watched the monitor do its steady arithmetic. When my mother finally arrived, wild-eyed, coat still buttoned wrong, she saw me already in the chair and said, "Not how is he, not thank God you're here." She said, "Did you bring your checkbook?" I looked at her for a long time before I answered. "I brought myself," I said. "That's what's left after you take the checkbook out of the equation." She didn't have a response to that. For once in her life, my mother was quiet, not because she'd chosen grace, but because there was genuinely nothing left in that particular drawer. Part 8. The note in the spokes. My father recovered enough to come home, but something in him had clearly downshifted. Not just physically. He started saying things out loud he'd have swallowed a year earlier. One of them, said to me quietly at the kitchen table while my mother was out, was this: "I'm going to make this right. Give me the summer." He didn't get the summer. He died in August, in his sleep, 3 days after his second cardiac event. And the last real conversation we ever had was in that kitchen, about nothing, the neighbor's fence again, if you can believe it. I've decided there's something merciful in that. Not every last conversation needs to be a speech. What I didn't expect was what I found in his garage 2 weeks after the funeral, when my mother asked me to help clear it out because she said she couldn't look at it anymore. Up on sawhorses, half restored, was my childhood bike, the blue one, the one I'd ridden until the frame was more rust than paint, the one I'd assumed had gone to a scrapyard decades ago. He'd been rebuilding it, new chain, new seat, tires still in their plastic wrapping on the workbench beside it, sanded frame, primed, one coat of blue paint already dry and a second one clearly planned, brushes still soaking in a jar of turpentine he never got to use, and tucked into the handlebar basket, in his blocky, careful hardware store printing, on the back of an old receipt pad, because of course it was, because the man narrated his entire emotional life in receipts, was a note, for wherever the road takes you next. Dad, not the house. Not an apology for the loan, or the meeting, or 31 months of quiet bleeding he'd let happen without ever once saying the word thank you. A bicycle. Something built for leaving, not staying. My father, who could not say the word sorry with his mouth, had apparently decided to say it with a wrench instead, and the message wasn't come back. It was go. I sat on the concrete garage floor and cried in a way I hadn't let myself do at the funeral, because at the funeral, everyone was watching to see if I'd fall apart, and I have never once given this family the performance they were waiting for. Part 9. The offer. Here's the twist I did not see coming, and I promise you, neither will you. 6 weeks after the funeral, my mother called a family meeting, the second one of these, in the same living room, minus one chair that nobody had the nerve to remove. She'd found a way, through a widow's benefit and a refinance she'd apparently negotiated herself, to save the house from the mess the equity line had left behind. But there was a catch, dressed up as a gift. She wanted to put the house in my name, immediately, today, in exchange for one thing, that I quietly co-sign, finally, formally, with my actual consent this time, the remaining balance on Caleb's brewery loan, so the bank would let the family keep it in the family. Everyone in that room thought they were watching me get everything I was owed. My mother reached over, took my hand in both of hers, warm, the way it always was, warmth being the one resource that family never ran short of, and said, "See, it was always going to come back to you." I looked around that room and understood, all at once, what the offer actually was. It wasn't reconciliation. It was the exact same architecture as before, just redrawn with my name finally, formally, on the load-bearing wall, permanently this time, with my own signature, so no one could call it fraud ever again. I told them I needed a week. I went home and did the only thing that has ever actually helped me make a real decision. I drew it. 2 floor plans, side by side, the way I'd draw a renovation. Plan A had a house in it, a porch, a kitchen I grew up in, my mother's hand in mine on Sundays. Plan B had nothing in it but open ground. And here's what I noticed, staring at both drawings past midnight, the same way I notice a bad structural detail on any blueprint. Every wall in Plan A was labeled with a feeling, home, mom, belonging, and every wall in Plan B was labeled with a fact, $61,400, 5 years, unknowing. 31 months, unthanked, 1 forged signature. Feelings make beautiful walls. That's exactly the problem with them. They hold weight in your chest, not in the ground. And I am, professionally, paid specifically to know the difference between the two. Part 10. What I actually signed. I went back for the second meeting with 1 folder. No speech. Inside it wasn't the co-signature. It was a printed timeline. Every transfer, every date, 5 years of it. The bank's own fraud dispute confirmation stapled to the front page, and at the bottom, where a balance would normally sit, I'd typed 1 line instead, discharged. No further liability. No further labor. Underneath it sat a second item, a photograph of the bicycle, repainted, Finished. I'd done the second coat myself, alone in my garage, 3 weekends after the funeral. I'm not co-signing, I said. I'm not taking the house on those terms. I already spent 5 years holding up a wall I never agreed to build. My mother's face did the slow ice thing I'd seen it do exactly once before, in that hospital hallway. The house was never about the money, she said quietly. I know, I said. That's what made it so easy to ask me for money, instead of an apology. I stood, and for the first time in 36 years, nobody in that room tried to stop me from leaving. Part 11. The road Caleb lost the brewery that winter. Not because of me. Because a business built on borrowed names eventually runs out of names to borrow. He and Priya moved in with her parents 2 towns over. He texts me sometimes, short and awkward, mostly photos of my niece. I always answer. Whatever happened between the adults in this story, that little girl didn't sign anything. My mother kept the house, smaller now, refinanced under her own name only, the way it always should have been. We have coffee on Sundays sometimes, an hour, no more, at her kitchen table instead of mine. She's never said the word sorry, not directly, but last month she poured my coffee before I'd even sat down, remembered how I take it, and I've decided to let that count for something. Not everything. Something. I closed on my own house in the spring, the brick 2-bedroom, the one that started this whole excavation the day Desmond turned that screen around. The mortgage payment is, almost to the dollar, what I used to send to Millhaven every month for 31 straight months. Same number. Finally pointed at something that's mine. The bike hangs on a rack in my garage now, fully restored, blue coat gleaming, the receipt pad note laminated and pinned above my workbench, where I can see it every morning. For wherever the road takes you next. He never got to say it out loud. He didn't need to. Some of the strongest structures I've ever studied were never load-bearing in the way people assumed. They were just standing quietly in the right place, holding up more than anyone ever gave them credit for, until the day somebody finally checked the blueprint and found out the truth. If somebody in your life has been treating your love like free labor, here's the only thing I know for certain. You're allowed to stop building for free. That's not abandoning the family. That's the first wall you ever build for yourself. If this one hit you somewhere specific, tell me in the comments what you would have signed, and what you never should have. Share it with somebody who's been quietly holding something up, and I'll see you in the next one.